good morning to you, Dr. Peter St Onge. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Efrat.
Thanks for coming. It's really my pleasure to host you. And I want to start for those who don't know Peter. Dr. Peter St Onge is an economist at the Heritage Foundation, a fellow at the Mises Institute, a former MBA professor, libertarian, and freedom maximalist, which I love. And that's one of the reasons why I started following you to begin with. And I've been a while now a reader of your Substack, a follower of yours on Twitter. I've been watching your daily videos and even listening to your weekly podcast. So thank you for all this ample content that you produce. I know how difficult it is to produce so much content. So thank you so much for doing that. This is really brilliant. And I learn a lot from you because what you do for me is you put everything in such simple language to help people that really don't know much about economy to understand it. So thank you for doing that. Can you start with some background about you, how you got to where you are today, even start as earlier as your childhood? I read about it and it was
Sure.
really fun.
Well, thank you for that glowing introduction. I really appreciate it. And yes, I do try to simplify things. It honestly makes me angry how these jerks who control the world hide this stuff behind this academic, mumbo jumbo and jargon. So that's a big reason why I do try to simplify it. None of this stuff is actually very complex. Basically, somebody's trying to rip you off, somebody's trying to control you, and the rest of it is decoration. So let's see, I studied economics in college, and then when I graduated, I graduated in Canada, and the economy, this was back in 1996. It was really rough, so I couldn't really get an economics job. And so I got a job in marketing, working for a big telecoms company. We were building telecoms infrastructure across
Mm-hmm.
Latin America. And then I went on to work for a toy company, a Japanese toy company called Takara. They make the Transformers and
Yep.
Beyblades. And so in both of those jobs, a big part of marketing fundamentally is applied psychology. Okay, so you're trying to understand, what does the customer want? Okay, what's
Yep.
missing in their life? What would make them happier? And whether this is a telecom system or whether it's a toy, the fundamental tools are identical. The
Correct.
customer needs something, and you would like to try to provide that to them in a way that it's worth their time, right? That they're paying you less than the happiness that they get from your product. And then you
Yeah.
can make a profit on that, and everybody walks away happy. So anyway, that's the world of marketing. And there was a point where I sort of sat down and tried to reconcile that with the model of behavior that you get from economics, because economics is also, in theory, applied psychology, where you're trying to model people. So why do they buy, sell, trade, build, destroy, have families? Why do people make choices? And what struck me is that in economics, you have these really, really beautiful models, just massive models that just have page after page of calculus and enormous budgets to sit and do research on this and model this out. And yet those models are false. They're garbage. The organizations that might use those behavioral models, such as a central bank or a government, they're
Mm-hmm.
constantly surprised. They're constantly caught flat-footed. We saw this in the 2008 crisis, where the crisis just seemed to come out of nowhere. All of our, diligent leaders, armed with their tens of thousands of PhDs, they all said, "Boy, it's weird. No idea what happened. Who could have predicted it?" And if you contrast that abject failure, okay, despite all the resources that go into, the applied psychology of economics, you contrast that with marketing. If you had that kind of record in marketing, right? If you kept coming out with products that failed and you said, well, it's just weird, nobody could have predicted this. If you had 10,000 PhDs sitting there cobbling together data for you, and yet your products kept failing, you'd be out of a job, right? You
Correct.
would no longer be controlling those decisions. And yet government
Correct.
just comes back day after day. Jerome Powell, he had promised us that inflation was transitory. Janet Yellen promised us that the banks were sound. Okay, and the next thing you know, you've got 28 months now of inflation. The IMF is saying we're looking at years more. You've got other people saying we're looking at decades more. So that was an abject failure. The banks got, they got 100 billion plus in direct bailout, the so-called BTFP program. They then got these FDIC coverages that they took the deposit insurance. Okay, so basically deposit on your bank, on the money that you have in the bank. It took that to about 1% cover. In other words, it's basically bankrupt. It's 99 times overstretched. So that's our fundamentally sound banks for you. It's just a complete litany of failures. So anyway, when I was working in marketing, I found it fascinating. Like, why is it that economics, it has so much prestige, people trust it so much, has so many, just billions of dollars worth of resources that go into this field, and it's just a complete failure. And, how do you reconcile that? And for me, what I concluded was
While
that
marketing works, I mean,
marketing
well, you can
works. Yeah.
manipulate people's behavior to get them to buy more, to consume more. Like,
Yeah.
it works.
Right. And the funny part is that economics in the hands of governments is trying to do the same thing, right? It's trying to manipulate you into spending more, into depending on what they want you to do, right? They want you to spend more if they need the economy, GDP to increase, or they want you to spend less if they want to reduce inflation. It's all applied marketing, but it's such a failure, and it's so bad at what it aims to do. And, I think where that's coming from, I talked about this recently on a Substack, but the field of economics was essentially captured by governments about 150 years ago, starting in Germany, because governments recognize that economists and economics is such a useful marketing tool fundamentally. The thing is that once it gets captured, and here I'm using Austrian analysis, you always want to model out the people making the actual decisions, okay? So the actual individuals in government who captured economics, those individuals' goals is not to grow the economy or to keep inflation low or to spread prosperity. Okay, that's what they say in public, but their actual goals are bureaucratic goals. They want to increase their power. They want to move up the slippery pole of government. Maybe they want to get a nice job out of government, a golden parachute. So economics once it becomes captured by government, it essentially becomes a crony operation where not only is it trying to manipulate people, it's trying to manipulate people for reasons other than what the government claims. Okay. So it is not trying to manipulate you to make the economy grow and to keep inflation low. It is trying to manipulate you essentially to smooth the path for government to take on more and more power. Why? So that politicians and bureaucrats can monetize that power, can sell it to the highest bidder, and then they personally can benefit. You see it in Washington, D.C. Some of the richest areas of America are the suburbs surrounding D.C. And of course, D.C. makes nothing, right? It's a giant parasite certainly on the American people, but arguably on the world. And yet, look how rich it is. It is a very rare congressman who, after a couple of years in government, they're all millionaires. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, I think she's relatively low on the crony polls. She's just started out. I'm sure she'll rise higher over time. But when she first came to Washington, she couldn't afford a place to live. Now she's got millions and millions.
So how is
Janet
that?
Yellen.
Lobbyists?
Yeah.
Why is that? Are they being bribed?
Yeah. Yes, essentially, right. It's lobbyists. Janet Yellen was making, I think, $650,000 per speech. She's not that good of a speaker. I can't
Wow.
imagine what insights she's sharing for that kind of money. And when somebody needs a favor, she's going to remember those fantastic afternoons talking at, what would that be, $10,000 a minute.
Oh my God. I wasn't aware of that they were getting so much money for
It's
public speaking.
insane. Yeah, for public
Oh,
speaking, quote unquote. Hillary Clinton got massive. I think she actually was paid more than Janet Yellen. And again, she's a good speaker. She's not that good.
wow.
Something else is going on there. Yes.
Of course, I'm sure. And I think this is fascinating what you said before about applying psychology in the end, to economics, but governments doing that to benefit themselves. We've seen it in the last 3 years with COVID. I think
Right.
one of the first the posts that I've written on my Facebook that became viral was trying to trying to explain to people the marketing campaign that is being run on them, with bribing them to take something in order to go get vaccinated, or
Yep.
to threaten them that if they don't do something they will get punishment, like using very simple marketing tools in order to
Yep.
manipulate their behavior. And it caught because people got it. They got that there is some kind of mechanism or tactic here that is being operated on them, but they at first they couldn't believe that the government will do that to them.
Yeah.
But then but then you realize how much money is flowing behind the scenes through
Oh,
pharma,
absolutely. Yeah.
especially here in Israel with all these agreements. I think our prime minister was the one that purchased those injections from
Yep.
Pfizer for a crazy amount of money, a lot
Yes.
more than any other country, because he wanted to be the first.
Right.
And so that was a driver of economy. And so to me, when you talk about economy in that way, I constantly think about marketing and how they apply those principles to try and manipulate people's behavior. Now, I don't want people to take me the wrong way and think that I think that marketing is only manipulating people. Of course not. There
Right.
is good marketing as well.
Right.
But in this case, it's being used in a way against us.
Yeah, there's what I like to call sustainable marketing, not in the stupid environmental sense, but in the sense that for marketing to be sustainable, right? In order to build a long-term relationship with the customer actually has to feel like they're benefiting from the relationship. And any marketer who rips off their customers, okay, you are going to, in marketing, you call it churn. Okay, you're going to churn
Yes,
through your customers. You're going to constantly be looking for new people because you ripped off the old ones. That is not how to
yes,
make money in marketing. That is not how you become, a billionaire. Okay, you do that by actually giving the customers what they want. And that's fascinating
value.
because then we can bring that back to what government's done. So government is constantly lying to us. It is marketing, I think, in a deceptive way. It is not sustainable marketing. And they pushed it so hard during COVID, not only for the shots themselves, when you look at the crony relationships, for example, with people on the FDA board, okay, where they're
Yeah,
actually being compensated by the companies. You've got that type of crony. Beyond that, they moved heaven and earth on the economy during COVID. Fundamentally, they wanted to bribe the public into accepting lockdowns, right? Certainly in America, we have really not since the 1600s have we had a situation where it was illegal to hold religious uh, meetings. Okay, you could not hold mass. You could not, assemble in groups allegedly because of COVID. And of course, weeks later they decided that you could riot. That's no problem
yeah.
because
For
that's
Black
different.
Lives Matter, that's fine.
Exactly. And so that was something that normally, if you would ask me in 2019, do you think the American public will be okay with banning church service? I would have said you're absolutely insane. They would never accept that. Why did they accept that? Because millions of people were being paid more money to sit on the couch than to go to work. Okay, the whole lockdown thing, right? When they came in with that, they said, so here's the deal. All you have to do is stay home, binge watch Netflix with a couple pints of Haagen-Dazs, all right, and we're going to pay you more than you used to make. A lot of people saw that as a good deal. I don't blame them. That is a heck of a deal. But of course, what that's given us now is we have just this cascade that's probably going to last at least a decade. We've got this cascade of economic effects. We've got the inflation that came out of that. In the U.S., we've got about 5 million people who pulled out of the workforce. Either they retired early or they went on government benefits. For a while there were essentially no questions asked during COVID if you wanted to go on government benefits. Once people go on benefits, they tend to stay on them. I
Mm-hmm.
suspect this is also true in Israel. I know there's a
Yes.
fairly well-developed welfare state there. It's going to be true across the world. So you've got, you had labor shortages that then whipsawed salaries. You've got the inflation. There was a point in the U.S. where about $1 out of $3 had fresh ink on it. It had just been printed up during the lockdowns, and they used that to finance the lockdowns, to pay all those people in the U.S. We had PPP loans that handed all this money to businesses. A lot of that, a huge amount of that was fraudulent. But the point is that was buying votes to convince people to accept these totalitarian lockdowns. And, now we're dealing with the after effects where, it's like you're in the bathtub, when you're a kid and, you swing from one side to the other. And before you know it, the water's all, pulling out of the
Wow.
bathtub. That is
Yeah.
where we are economically. It's just they push the pendulum so far over that, I mean, really, none of us know what's coming next. These are such huge changes.
And at the same time, they also killed a lot of the small, medium businesses.
For sure. Absolutely. Right.
Uh,
And that's,
Is
yeah,
that part of
they,
the inflation? Is that part of like how do we not the inflation, but how do we make our situation better without stopping to spend government money? We will kill off some of the private sector, right?
yeah,
In
that's
order to help
really
ourselves.
right. And, that's really, that's what the Fed is openly trying to do at this point. So, most meetings, Jerome Powell comes out and complains about how there's too many jobs, and he needs more job losses, which implies bankruptcies, which implies destroyed lives. But really, essentially, what's happening in the U.S. right now, I suspect is true in many countries in the world, is that they printed up all this money. It caused the inflation. What's happening right now is that governments are still printing out these massive budget deficits. Essentially, there's a pattern where if the government grows, let's say because of a war or because of COVID, it typically doesn't shrink back to the original size, right? It might at best give about half of it back as sort of a historical pattern. So there's this ratchet effect where the government gets bigger and bigger. And so what's happened after COVID now is that the pandemic is long gone, but we've still got the spending, right? So in the US, for example, they're looking at what I think $1.5 to $2 trillion deficits essentially forever. Those were unheard of before COVID. And so that is creating ongoing inflation because you get all this new money that's being pumped into the market. And what they could do if they wanted to stop inflation would be to sit down with the government and say, look, you guys have a problem. You have an addiction. You need to quit with the spending, pull that in. Of course, that's an uncomfortable conversation because national legislators control the central banks. So the central bank would be criticizing their boss. And central banks don't want to lose their independence. They want to be able to control the money supply. They don't want the people through their legislators to control that. So they don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation. So instead, they go to plan B, which is crush the private sector. And that's exactly what's happening now, where governments all over the world have increased interest rates. That raises borrowing costs, and it tends to crush private businesses. It also crushes households. They lose their job. Meanwhile, they can't borrow because rates are so high. Credit standards tighten. And so that's really what he's doing, is sacrificing regular people. Sort of think of it as Joe Biden needs his ice cream and they're clearing the highway of all of the private cars so that the government can spend as much as possible. So the idea is that if we, the people, spend less, right, then that takes pressure off of inflation. And then the government can spend everything that its dark little heart desires and sort of soak up the inflation instead.
Okay, people normally think that inflation is just prices going up, but they don't get that it's
Right.
the government printing more money or creating more money. And that you said something really nice the other day when I listened to you. Inflation is money chasing goods.
That's exactly right. So you can sort of think of it as if there's a whole bunch of money for sale and there's a whole bunch of goods for sale. And that's very counterintuitive for most people because people don't think that money is for sale. And
Mm-hmm.
but think of it like you're a business, right? So if you go to the grocery store right before they close for the
Mm-hmm.
day,
Mm-hmm.
you can't offer them $1 for everything in the store. Why? Because they're speculating that they'll be able to open tomorrow and that they'll be
Correct.
able to sell all those cans of soup tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah.
So only a certain amount of things are functionally for sale. There's a lot of stuff it's effectively in inventory. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They're willing to sell it at a certain price, but not at any price whatsoever. All right. And similarly, most money is actually saved up. Okay. It's not being offered. Sorry, I'm just going to move you over here. It's not being offered at any given moment for goods. Okay. It's in a savings account or it's in a retirement account or something like that. So there's only a certain amount of money that people are sort of psychologically willing to spend that month. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
most of the rest of the money is effectively in inventory. So you've
Mm-hmm.
got stores that have a bunch of stuff to sell. You have regular people who have a bunch of money. They have a bunch of budget, so they've got a bunch of money that they're ready to sell. And you can basically just divide one by the other, and that gives you what the inflation is in any given moment. Now, what that means is that the main thing that government can do to influence that number historically is that government prints a bunch more money, right? So if we take COVID, for example, what the Fed was doing effectively was allowing these huge government deficits because the Fed would stand ready to go in and buy them. In fact, they did buy a lot of them. They bought government bonds, which is effectively printing money and handing it to the government in exchange for an IOU. And then the government flooded all that money out. It gave it out in stimulus checks or in government spending. So what that meant is that if you take those two piles, you got the goods for sale and the money for sale, all of a sudden you had this huge increase in the money for sale. People had a bunch of money. And so that money was effectively chasing the remaining goods. Now, during COVID, it was even worse because the stuff for sale actually went down as well, right? You had supply chains were jammed. There are a variety of reasons. You had warehouses that were closed because they couldn't find enough workers.
Small
China
businesses were
also,
closing.
that's exactly right. And so the effect was compounded. So you had less stuff than normal. You had more money than normal. And so therefore you got higher prices. The thing about inflation itself, like when you kind of zoom out, so for hundreds and hundreds of years, everybody had understood the word inflation to mean increase in the amount of money in existence. And the Fed actually did a paper on this because this is not a conspiracy theory. The Fed itself has a paper where they talk about the evolution of the meaning of inflation, that it used to mean printing more money. If you inflate the money supply, then you would print more money. And everybody knew that if you print more money, that's too much money chasing too few goods. And so you'll get higher prices. And what happened, partly the Fed was part of the game, but they wanted to sort of hide why the prices are rising. They wanted to talk about Mr. Putin's war, or the Arab oil embargo, or just whatever they can find in the newspaper. They want to try to find as many scapegoats as possible. And so the way they've really successfully done that is to confuse people into thinking that the word inflation means price rises, when actually inflation means a rise in the amount of money, and a rise in the amount of money always historically leads to a rise in prices. If we look at Weimar Germany, for example, that was not supply chains, and you don't get 1,000,000,000% inflation from these sort of headline grabbing things. It's very easy to see why Weimar had hyperinflation, because they were printing so much money. And this is the case all the time. We normally can't see it because the relationship is not one-to-one, right? So if they print up a bunch of money, in 2008, for example, they printed money and they gave it to the banks. And so the banks kept it. Okay, so it was not chasing goods, right? It was not money for sale. It was savings. All right, so in that case, it didn't increase inflation, even though a lot of people thought it was going to at the time. So there's usually a transmission. It can take 3 or 6 or 12 months for the inflation to actually translate into rising prices. But that confusion is very important, because I think out of the topics in economics, one of the most understood, like one of the hardest for people to grasp, is money, inflation, how prices rise. And I do think a big part of that is that they have intentionally sort of muddied the waters and made it unclear to people. They try to hide exactly what's happening. And in fact, you've got the Federal Reserve. They put out comic books aimed at children to try to explain how the economy works and how inflation works. And that's exactly the garbage they put out. They do not mention how much money was created. They do not mention fractional reserve, which is where banks pyramid on top of the money, so they can relend your money out essentially over and over. They don't mention any of that. The actual causes of a rising money supply, inflation, which then leads to prices. Okay, they don't want to talk about any of that. Instead, they play this game where it's all headline stuff. It's, you had the oil and you had the war, whatever else they can find in the headlines to try to justify why the prices are going up. And then, of course, the Federal Reserve, fundamentally, they're the ones driving the inflation. They are the only ones who are driving the inflation because they're the only ones who are allowed to print money, either directly or by effectively licensing commercial banks through the bailout function. But fundamentally, the Federal Reserve is the only one who can create inflation. This is what Milton Friedman, he said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But they want, if people accept this sort of headline driven, you got the boat stuck in the Suez and whatnot, if people accept that, then the Fed can actually portray itself as a firefighter when it is the arsonist, right? So the Fed creates the inflation, and then it has this whole narrative where, if you look up in the newspaper, most mentions of the Fed are going to be talking about the Fed fighting inflation. This is the arsonist posing as a fire. They are the only cause of inflation.
Yes.
Why do they fight inflation? Well, because my favorite metaphor is a gasoline thief. Okay, so if you steal gasoline from your neighbors, the trick there is you just take a little bit every day. Okay, you take maybe 1 or 2 liters a day. You don't empty their tanks, for God's sakes. That's going to be the end of the game. They're going to notice that. And so the trick is you just take a little bit at a time. So when the Fed is fighting inflation, the inflation they caused, what they're saying is, oops, we created too much. We either printed too much money or we allowed banks, commercial banks, to print too much money. Either way, this is embarrassing. The voters are angry because prices are going up 5 or 10%. If the voters get angry, Congress gets angry. If Congress gets angry, then the whole hustle is over. We're going to lose our power to inflate. So yes, most of the time when you read about the Fed, they're trying to fight the inflation they caused because it got away from them.
And it is so convenient that people think that they're the savior when really they're the cause of this.
This is true for all of government. I mean,
yes.
The wars are started by government. People don't start wars, okay? Governments are the only ones who can start wars. And always the governments come in and they say, we are here to protect you. And you say, protect us from what? They say, from wars. Who's starting the wars? Like every single problem. The poverty, the generations of people who they go to public schools that are they come out unable to read, or they're lifelong criminals. You have social disorder. You have all of these social problems that are fundamentally caused by governments. And then what's amazing is governments get up there with a straight face with their nice, expensive suits that their lobbyists bought for them, and they portray themselves as the savior of all the problems they're causing.
Wow. And if I relate that also to, we're talking about wars. This is naturally something I wanted to talk to you about, because economies seem to be driven by wars, conflicts, and emergencies. And you wrote an excellent article called "The Fed as VC of Venture Capital of the Crisis Industrial Complex." And you wrote about the crises that are brought to us by the Fed or the central bank, right? How they can be a driver to all those different crises in order to cover up on things. And you quoted something really interesting there that I saw. Chaos is not a pit; chaos is a ladder, right?
Right. Yeah. That's a classic quote from Game of Thrones. Yeah, Peter
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And, and I'm looking at what's happening here right now with this war in Israel, Hamas, and I see the chaos. I feel it. And
it's
to
horrible.
me, I definitely feel that a lot of this is intentional. A lot of this is being allowed to happen. And there are more, obviously it's a bigger conflict than just Israel and Palestine. This is way, way bigger. We see the involvement of the US and Russia and China behind the scenes, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. So, how are they using this chaos as a ladder? How are those crises moving or shaping economies?
Yeah, I think it's a huge concern. Traditionally, we all sort of imagine that the job of government is to prevent crises. And certainly, speaking from the perspective of the US, it looks a lot like the US is trying to foment as many wars as possible. We have
Yeah.
soldiers. I mean, I don't know. It's something like over 100 countries that we have active duty soldiers in. It starts to look a lot like venture capital investments, you know, where you put a little $100,000 here, a couple million there, and you hope that one of
Yeah.
them grows into a nice big war, so that you can make a lot of money for Lockheed Martin and Boeing. It's horrific, and I think if the U.S. were not involved, then there are a lot of conflicts in the world. To keep it relatively unemotional, I'll just stick with Russia and Ukraine. Um, there's a negotiation to be had there. The people in the eastern Ukraine are largely Russian speaking. They were not thrilled being part of Ukraine. In a sane world, they would have had some kind of autonomy or perhaps independence, just like the United States got independence from a country that it was not happy with. That would have been negotiated if the U.S. and Europe, as sort of a U.S. crony, did not stand ready to invest in that war.
Hmm.
It sort of pays. I think there are a lot of conflicts in the world where it pays both sides to keep the war running, and there are often very easy solutions to these wars, but I don't think they get a hearing because Washington is so ready to invest in these conflicts. And why is it so ready to invest? I think it's fundamentally the lobbyists. And sort of, I think the bigger picture here is going back to that idea that governments exist to neutralize crises. And I think what we've seen over certainly the past couple of decades is that it's starting to look like governments actually sort of like these crises. In fact, they might take things that are not crises and they might elevate them. So they might take, say, a respiratory infection and elevate that into a pretend world-ending pandemic. They might take global warming, which may or may not be occurring, but it's certainly not catastrophic. CO2 is wonderful for plants. There's not enough CO2 in the world for plants. If we look at parts of the world that are warmer, they typically have more people living them. They have much more farm production. Siberia is not great for farming. Nobody lives
Hmm.
there. You could
Hmm.
argue that the world should be warmer. But at any rate, this is certainly not a world-ending catastrophe.
Yeah.
Earth's temperature has fluctuated a lot. Indeed, people live in, what is the temperature in Malaysia or Singapore? Many people live there happily, and that temperature is, I don't know, 20 degrees higher than it is in Canada.
Yeah.
Apparently, we can live in a variety of environments. So
Yeah.
I think the concern here is that governments, for whatever reason, they have noticed that every crisis grows their power, grows their budget, grows their personal fortunes. They can make money off the crony relationships. And so in a way, governments are actually enthusiastic about crises, like they want crises. It certainly felt like that in Ukraine, where, United States policy, even in the face of potential nuclear war, the U.S. seemed to sort of enjoy pushing the limits. Let's give them F-16s. Let's give them ballistic missiles. Like, what? Why are you playing with fire? Like, isn't your job to minimize crises, not
Yeah.
actually to invent new crises? And I think really what's driving that is central banks. So central banks can effectively finance that early stage of the crisis. If you take the Afghan conflict, for example, right? So clearly the U.S. had to punish the perpetrators of 9/11, just as I think Israel does at the moment.
Hmm. Hmm.
But in the U.S. case, that then turned into a 20-year occupation. The U.S. has very little national interests in Afghanistan. There's no reason to occupy Afghanistan, but it paid enormously well. And moreover, what happened was that to the American people, the cost was hidden. Okay, because the Afghan conflict could be funded by deficit spending, for the
Hmm.
American people, the ultimately $2 trillion and many American lives that were lost in Afghanistan, those appeared to be costless because they were deficit funded. Why could they be deficit funded? Because the central bank stood ready to take care of all those things. So I think that that's a real risk. It's a major reason to get rid of central banks is that they hide the costs of new crises so that voters can either be neutral about new crises, they can be okay with them, or maybe sometimes they get excited about them. Yeah, let's go blow up crap. because they can't see the costs, right? The costs are hidden. If you sort of imagine a world without central bankers, then in the US context, they would actually have to sit down with families and they'd have to say, okay, I'm going to take, $1,000 from every household for Ukraine, and you're going to have to pay that next month. And there would be a lot of Americans who would say, why do I care about Ukraine? Right? They would have a very different attitude if it weren't funded by deficits that are ultimately financed by central banks.
So, Peter, then it really helps that the fiat system is so complicated to understand, because then people cannot resist, or they cannot really fully comprehend how the system works and how it's taking money from them
Right.
in the
Yeah,
end of the
that's
day, because it's so, like, there are so many layers, there are so many levels that go through from the moment that they say, okay, we're going to support this country for a war, until it really hits your pocket, you sitting at home.
that's what ends up happening. And of course, by the time it hits your pocket, well, we're already 5 years in. You've
Mm-hmm.
got, you've got so many dead people, who at that point, the voters are not going to say, well, okay, forget about it. Let's just go home. Okay.
Yeah.
They can sort of float the war until voters are committed. Okay. Like at this point, you will have had so many outrages committed against your own soldiers or perhaps your own civilians that voters are sort of locked in. They
Yeah.
understandably have to stick with the war. And
Yeah.
so it hides the costs long enough for voters to become committed.
Okay. And if I take you from here to some of the, sound alternatives of money, I mean, we're not going to get to how fiat works, but I do encourage people to go and check. If they don't get how the system works today, they should definitely research it. But then let's talk about gold and Bitcoin a little bit as alternatives to the monetary system that we know. And I would say that most people use the current monetary system because they just simply see other people around them using it. They
Yeah.
really don't
Mm-hmm.
understand, and they trust that
Right.
if everyone's using it, then it's fine. And since not very many people use gold and Bitcoin, they're very hesitant about it. And then they have all
Right.
these concerns.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Most people, they don't know much about the monetary system. They don't care about it very much. It works. They see other people using it. When we lived in a gold standard up until Nixon broke it, well, really FDR broke it and then Nixon finished it off.
Mm-hmm.
In that gold standard era, people would have looked at you like you were insane if you suggested our current system, which is that the government can print, or the central bank at the behest of the government can print unlimited amounts of tokens called dollars. And then those tokens, it's like water poured into wine. They will then dilute your dollars. All right. So they can functionally steal your money that way. If you had suggested that to people in the gold standard era, they would have thought you're absolutely insane. But yet that is the system that we have today. And then, of course, today, if you go to people and you say, okay, we're going to have a gold standard, then they assume you're crazy as well. Most people, they don't understand how money works. They don't want to understand. They just want it to work. And then, of course, every so often they screw it up so badly that you get 10% inflation, or, you get a lot of the inflation that goes into housing or other asset prices. And then people say, why are houses so expensive? And then you have to kind of sit down with them and explain how fiat money works and why exactly the central bank is doing this to you, or why they have the ability to do this to you. And if you can explain that, then yes, they can come around to gold if they can actually understand that, these kinds of things did not happen under a gold standard. In the US, up until the Federal Reserve, so if you take the, 150 years between independence and the Federal Reserve, we had no inflation. We had zero
Really?
aggregate inflation. Yeah, there were periods where prices might go up, and then there were other periods where they went down, and it evened out to, I think it was like 0.02% aggregate, like
Wow.
over like per year. I mean, it was essentially zero inflation over 150 years. And this is actually kind of amazing from an economic historian perspective. Effectively, what was happening was that as the economy grew, okay, that meant more stuff was for sale. Okay, normally that would have made the dollar stronger. But then what was happening was people were discovering new gold deposits. Okay, they were mining more gold. So that meant that you had more money for sale now. Okay, remember
Yeah.
those two piles, the stuff for sale, the money for sale. So there was more gold because of, gold discoveries. But then there was also more stuff because the economy was growing. What's kind of amazing to me is that over 150 years, those were just imperfect. They were perfectly proportional, which to
Yes.
me is kind of stunning. It's almost like the hand of God. Like, why is gold able to perfectly match the broader economy? I mean, keep in mind, like, you have economic historians who go back and try to estimate what the economy was doing in like 1860, and they can't figure it out. Okay, but yet gold knows. Okay, gold can just perfectly match exactly what the economy is doing, which is pretty impressive. Now, of course, now we have something new, which is Bitcoin. And I think that the situation with Bitcoin is very similar to gold. So, like, if you take somebody who is living in the fiat system, or even somebody who understands what a gold standard looks like, and you tell them, okay, I'm going to base it on ones and zeros that have no physical instantiation, they are going to look at you like you are insane. And
Especially boomers and Gen X. That's what
for
I
sure,
get.
for
Yeah.
sure. And I think the key there is, first off, I think to understand what Bitcoin is, that it is very, very secure. I think
Hmm.
when you hear about quote unquote Bitcoin hacks, those are not Bitcoin hacks. Those are hacks of websites of companies that are buying or selling Bitcoin, okay, known as
Hmm.
exchanges. That would be like
Yes.
if Amazon.com gets hacked, that is not the dollar getting hacked. That is not the US
Exactly.
dollar. And so it's similar with Bitcoin. And in terms of what to me anyway is interesting about Bitcoin is that in many ways it is a superior version of gold. And the key benefits it has is first of all, the inflation rate is fixed. Okay, gold did magically manage to grow in line with the economy, but what would be even nicer is having a money that has zero water being poured into the wine. Okay, and
Hmm.
and that is ultimately Bitcoin. It's not yet. It has an inflation rate that goes down little by little every 4 years. Currently, Bitcoin is just about matching gold in the inflation rate. And I'm using the old school
Yes.
definition of inflation, meaning how much new money is printed every year. So gold is printed, new gold is discovered at about 1.5% a year. Bitcoin is also, I believe, around that rate. That's about to drop
Hmm.
in, I think, next
Next
year.
year.
And,
Next year.
and at that point, Bitcoin will grow about half as fast as gold. So that's one benefit. But I think really the most important, so in other words, Bitcoin is harder than gold fundamentally. I think the other really important aspect of Bitcoin is that it is unseizable. Okay, government cannot seize Bitcoin. And this goes back to
Unless they catch you and torture you.
they could catch you and torture you. And yes, they could seize your specific hunk of Bitcoin. If you look back sort of historically, so if you are a gold bug and you're talking to somebody who's a fan of the fiat money system,
Yeah.
a common response might be they'll say, okay, there are 200 countries in the world. None of those countries use gold. So if gold
Hmm.
is so amazing, why doesn't anybody use it? And I think the answer to that question is because governments are very, very good at violence. It's their specialty. It's the only thing they're good at. And well, actually, they're not particularly good at it, but anyway, it's the only thing they do. And what happens in a gold system is that you can't put out a gold certificate and say, okay, this is backed by gold, which I've hidden in a secret location. Okay,
Yes.
can't do it. Nobody's going to accept your piece of paper, right? You actually
Yes.
have to show people the gold, which means it has to be guarded somewhere, generally centralized in like a fort that has, men surrounding it and sharks with lasers on their head. And so that kind of infrastructure is going to be very, very easy for a government to find. I mean, you
Yes.
have to publicize it. You says here is the gold. Here's the camera of the vault to show you the
Yeah.
gold is there. And the
Yeah.
government's it's going to be easy to come visit you, and then the government's going to have a sit down, and they're going to tell you what they need you to do with that gold. And that has happened across history, really fundamentally. Well, at any rate, it happened in the U.S. It's happened many, many times through
It
history where the
happened in
government essentially
74
comes in. That's what happened with FDR in
with FDR
1932, I want to
71.
say. Yep.
Okay.
71 was where Nixon. So FDR seized the gold. He made it illegal to own gold. There were a lot of people who kept their gold, but they couldn't transact it because you would get arrested for that. I mean, you would be showing the government that you actually have the gold. So anyway,
Yes.
they seized it, and a lot of that went into Fort Knox. So Fort Knox, which Americans are very proud of as the gold store, that is stolen goods that should be
Oh,
returned to the victims. But at any rate, then the U.S. continued what's called the gold window, where other countries were allowed to trade their dollars for gold. They continued that system for about 40 years. And the reason they did that was that they wanted other countries to be to stay dependent on the U.S. dollar. It's a big reason why the U.S. dollar became the reserve currency in the world. But at any rate, that continued until 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. He actually said it was temporary. So I'm going to take government at their word, and I'm
are you
waiting
still
any
waiting?
moment now. Yeah, that was 50 years later. We're still waiting on that, but any day now, I'm sure they're going to reopen the gold window
It's
and
like the 2 weeks of
reestablish.
COVID to flatten the curve.
That,
Same thing.
that's exactly right. Yes, Nixon said 2 weeks to close the gold window.
Amazing. Okay, got it. Good. Some people tell me Satoshi might be a CIA figure. I told them, who cares who he is? Like, I mean, his identity. I mean, it
Yeah,
works. The currency works. So
yeah, well, that's the beauty of it, is that you want a tech where you don't care who invented it. Like, he could be the most evil person on earth. It does not matter. It's a bit like the internet. Like, none of
yeah,
us actually care who invented the internet because it doesn't matter.
exactly.
There's, I mean, the internet is kind of a mixed bag. I think a lot of the people who did invent it were generally libertarians. They were very pro freedom, and they thought that the internet was going to lead to a democratization of communication and information, which it did. But of course, in the case of the internet, you had this unintended consequence where governments also are now using it as a panopticon, as a totalitarian instrument to surveil and control people. So
Exactly.
apparently that's a battle that, I think is probably going to be permanent. We're going to have to keep fighting them off. We just had Nikki Haley in our government attack
I saw her
online.
today. Yeah, love it.
Yes. A,
She's
a, a,
something special.
a reminder, at least for Americans, that it doesn't matter which party,
They're
pretty much all
normalizing
of them. Yeah.
censorship. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
And we now
The
have in Israel new rules and regulations, thanks to the war, that they're legally can censor us. So, it's happening everywhere.
Yeah, and governments love it. Historically, when governments have used war to restrict rights, in the U.S., we had a very strong free speech culture. The first break in that was really World War I. So they're arresting people who opposed the war. The people who, and then FDR did it again. And the people who did these things were not punished, and so government will keep doing them, even in the US, which I think has arguably the strongest legal protections for free speech. But even here, I mean, the past couple of years we've seen it. Tucker Carlson was being attacked as a Putin stooge, and there were politicians suggesting that he should be censored. War is the health of the state. It gives them budget, it gives them money, it gives them control. And all governments very much want to silence the people so that only they can talk.
Unbelievable. Do I have a few more minutes with you since we have
Yes.
this? Yeah, just a few
Yes,
more minutes. Okay, so
you
I'm
did. Yep.
gonna I'm gonna ask you about your vision or prediction for universal basic income, together with AI, and then leading us down the path of CBDC for an even greater total control. How do you see that
Yep.
panning out?
Yeah, UBI, I think they're absolutely going to push. They already had a test run during COVID. So there were a lot of countries, Canada, for example, that pushed out pretty much an explicit UBI. In the US, there have been a lot of sort of tests where they've tried to push out a UBI. What they're hoping to do is to generate data where they can try to convince people that a UBI is positive. Of course, a UBI is very destructive. So the idea is that you just pay people money to not work at all.
Hmm.
That is, that's the Roman bread in the bread and circuses formula. And
Hmm.
of course, when you start doing that, you have to ask at that point, well, somebody has to feed these people. So who exactly is doing that? And government has no assets of its own. Everything government has is stolen. So if government is going to be giving some people food without working, then it means it's going to be taking that for other people. So you get this progression where you have a smaller and smaller percent of the population who's working, and those
Mm-hmm.
people have to support a larger and larger class of dependents. We already have a lot of dependents in the US,
Mm-hmm.
but that would certainly increase. And a second problem, which I didn't actually realize, I was living in Canada during the pandemic, and it didn't occur to me until I saw it in living color, that in Canada, one of the first things they shut down was blue collar work. Okay, so construction workers, truck drivers, person to person contact, blue collar type jobs, those were effectively banned. White collar workers still kept to hang out and type away on their computers. And I was surprised at the time, like, why didn't the left get upset about this, about all
Yeah.
these jobs being destroyed? Because this was
Yes.
their constituency. These are the first rungs on the economic ladder for young people or for people who
Correct.
don't have very good skills. And there was no protest whatsoever. The left was just like, yep, that's good. Get rid of all the waitresses, the truck drivers, construction workers. And I think the reason was because they had that UBI in place.
Oh.
Okay, so in other words, those kind
Mm-hmm.
of lower skill jobs, they're usually not very appealing. They're not very
Mm-hmm.
impressive. Okay, they don't
Mm-hmm.
pay that well. Some of those jobs are dirty. You're cleaning people's houses or something, and so like they sort of don't have a built-in constituency. And so once you have a UBI, I think that support for those jobs just melts. And the problem is that those jobs are the first rung on the ladder. Okay,
Yes.
like that's where people start to build skills. They learn how to come to work on time. You know,
Yes.
they just learn like human 101. How do you interact with a
Yeah.
customer? And so if you knock those rungs out, then I think you get what we're starting to see really in a lot of the world now, where you get these young people who are in their 20s, and when they look at a decent job, they can't see a path to get from here to there.
Yes.
It feels like jumping across a canyon, like, a 30-meter. And, the older people say, well, you just got to jump harder, and they can't see the path. And the reason is because those rungs are being knocked out. So I think that a UBI is catastrophic, but I think it's also guaranteed it's incoming because it's a huge vote winner. We also saw that from COVID.
Oof. And with CBDC, it's going to be even easier for them to bring it on. Their
Absolutely. Yep.
their pilot
Yeah.
now in Thailand is
Yep.
for the poorer people. They want to
Mm-hmm.
lure them in through giving them free money. So
That's exactly what they'll try to do. Just
yeah,
like with COVID, how they bribed people by, paying a certain percent of the population to sit on the couch. Exactly the same game. They will take the bottom 20, 30%. Those are relatively cheap votes to buy. So they will combine a CBDC with a UBI. They'll say, we need the CBDC in order to automate the UBI so that the payments can be automatic. You can probably get 20% of the population to jump on board just out of the sheer money. You combine that with the 40% of the population who are totalitarians to begin with, and you get a winning coalition.
I really hope they're not going to expedite their CBDC launch here in Israel, which I know they're working
Yep.
on very, very diligently because of the war, because they are making
Yes.
sounds of it. A lot of people are being evacuated from their homes, their businesses are being closed down. They have to live in a temporary
Yeah.
hotel or whatever. And so this is the classic time for them to start bringing people on board those platforms. So let's
This
see.
is always the concern. I used to teach in one of my classes on business strategy. I would teach about regulations, and there was this one of my favorite charts was that you can map out the regulations year by year. Okay. And this is back right after the 2008 crisis. And you can see
Yep.
regulations in environment, labor, safety, whatever. There's all these regulations governments do. And you had
Yep.
this nice chart where it kind of bumps along smoothly. And then you had the 2008 crisis, and every single regulation exploded. Okay, not only financial regulation, which you would expect, it was a 2008 financial crisis, but actually
Yes.
environmental regulation. Every single regulation soared. All right, and that's a very important point. When government has the crisis they want, they will grow everything, right? So, I mean, absolutely, I'm Not surprised that the Israeli government is pushing CBDCs. They are going to push all of it. They're going to push the green stuff. I'm assuming that schools are an issue, that they'll be
Yes.
pushing to shut parents out of school decisions across the board. Stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with the war, they will take the opportunity to push them all.
Unbelievable. Okay, and my last question, and maybe the most important one, I hear a lot of people like you and financial experts that I follow talking about the end of a cycle that we're in now, a monetary cycle.
Right.
You talked about it a little bit at the Bitcoin Amsterdam conference that we were both in, and and the upcoming financial collapse that everyone's talking about. We're seeing a lot of different dots in this
Mm-hmm.
game of the US hegemony destabilization, the BRICS gaining more power, banks are starting to collapse, the Fed's printing more money, and there are many indications for a collapse coming. So I'm curious about your outlook on these changes in the US hegemony and the US dollar domination. Like, how do you see this playing out? And I know this is very dynamic because everything can change, especially in light of that war, which is
Right.
obviously related to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure you have some insights about it.
Yeah, I think if we go back through history, we know how the book ends. We don't know how every chapter ends.
Yes.
We are in many ways, we've been down this road 100 times before. Fiat meaning unlimited printing of money, that has been tried many times through history, starting with the Song Dynasty China in about 950 or 1050 AD. And every time it leads to the same thing, which is hyperinflation and, by the way, global war. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
every single time you have hyperinflation, it does lead to war. The government tries to distract people. Perhaps it tries to export the young men. They're less trouble overseas than they might be at home. It's always the same combination every single time. I've actually written on this on Song Dynasty China. They went to war with everybody. And by the way, they lost those wars over and over. Ultimately, they got conquered by the Mongols. And then the
Mm-hmm.
Mongols put the Chinese government in chains. At the time, China was almost half of world GDP. It was quite dominant. And that's what they used as the war elephant to take over the world. It was not because the
Mm-hmm.
Mongols were amazing fighters. It was because China printed fiat money, collapsed its economy, couldn't pay the soldiers defected. Same pattern every single time. If we look at where we are today, we've actually never been where we are today, which is that every country in the world is on fiat money. That has never occurred before. It's a very risky experiment they're running. We are seeing it play out here where, sort of the first control on that kind of keeps it from collapsing is don't print too much money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're starting to break that now. They broke it first in the 1970s, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was then corrected. Paul Volcker. When I speak of the U.S., really the entire world's monetary
Yeah.
system is still
Yeah.
dependent on the U.S. So Paul Volcker
Yes.
effectively controls hyperinflation for the entire Earth. Whether that's a good or bad thing, anyway, that is the world we live in. They fixed it in the 1970s, and then now it's gotten away from them again, where they printed too much money. Now inflation is starting to take off. And the question I think this time around is, do they have the ability to control themselves like they did in the 1970s? And that's really going to be the open question here. So in the US, for example, we almost had a failed treasury auction last week. Those are the kinds of warning signs that they should
Yes.
be waking up. They should be
Yes.
cutting back the government spending, trying to reduce the amount of debt that's coming out. But of course, you've seen nothing approaching that. We just had Janet Yellen, Joe Biden talking about how we can pay for all the wars. Give me
Yeah.
more. I want
Yeah.
more. This isn't even a challenge, people. So I think that there is no control on it. I think that they're going to keep going as fast as they can, as fast as the voters will accept, meaning as much debt as possible, as much inflation as possible. We've already got a lot of economists like Paul Krugman who are trying to sell 3% inflation. They're saying, there's no real logical reason why your money erodes at 2% a year. Let's make it erode at 3%. they've got this entire paid army of economists who basically propagandize for inflation. So the question is, they're going to mobilize all of that. They're going to try to keep pushing, keep getting closer and closer as they can to that hyperinflation. And, we don't know if that's going to take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I think it is interesting if we're talking about what comes next, where, historically, when you do get to that inflationary crash, the world always goes back to hard money. And historically, that's generally been gold or silver, which operate pretty much the same way. What for me is interesting is that depending when the collapse comes, are we going, if it's 20 years down the road, I think there's a good chance that we actually skip gold this time and go directly to Bitcoin, which for me would be pretty interesting, because if we go to Bitcoin, that actually ends the cycle, right? The problem with gold, as much as I love gold, the problem with gold is that physical vulnerability. The same thing that gives gold its value, okay, the fact that you can drop it on your foot, that is also what makes it vulnerable to governments. And that's why we have these cycles each time. Government screws it up, people go back to hard money. Government, drives like the policemen's in the rearview mirror. Okay, they drive safe for a couple of years, and then they do the same thing again. They seize the gold, and then it's off to the races. So what for me is exciting about Bitcoin is that it holds the prospect that because it cannot be seized by government, the next crash could be, or the next cycle, the next monetary crisis cycle could be the last one.
Amen to that. I really hope so. And on that note, if you don't have Bitcoin, go get some.
Get some Bitcoin. It might just catch on. Yes.
Exactly. Wow. So after being in Amsterdam in this conference, it really opened my eyes. I'm a Bitcoiner already for like a couple of years, but that conference really gave me some hope for humanity, because I really feel like we're down that vicious spiral, and it's got to stop somewhere. Are we going to start another cycle of 80 years? You know what I mean? I don't want to be that. Not for me, for my son. I don't want that.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
and I am optimistic, for the record. All of the elite is arrayed against us. It's almost hilarious what we're up against. I mean, we are outnumbered like 10 to 1, 100 to 1. It's even, where I work at Heritage, we're relatively well funded and well resourced, and even then we are so outmatched. It is absolutely hilarious. All you can do is laugh. But the thing that gives me optimism is the people are absolutely with us. Once you open their eyes, once they can actually see what's going on, because the elite narrative does not make sense. It is internally inconsistent. It's gobbledygook. It's garbage. Once you actually, if you have a chance to sit down and talk with people, they flip. And once they flip, they stayed flipped. You open their eyes, you
red pill them, and then you orange pill them.
That's bingo. Nicely put. That's exactly how I was going to put it. Right. So I am actually very optimistic. You see, trust collapsing in news media, in Hollywood, in the education system in the US, which is government propaganda. It is very exciting to me. Absolutely. So I am very optimistic. It is going to be an unpleasant 10 years.
I agree.
But I am very excited for what comes next.
Me too. Wow. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for a wonderful conversation. And please,
I really enjoyed it.
Keep going with your content. You are just amazing. And
I love
I'm going to
doing
put a link.
Yes, please do.
I'm going to put a link in the notes so that everyone can follow you. And,
awesome.
Just thank you. Huge thank you.
I was going to say, it is an absolute honor to do it. I've been so thrilled how many people want to understand these topics. And I mean, just people, there are millions and millions of people whose eyes are open, and it's just a thrill of a ride.
And I would just add that your reach on Twitter and in some of the other platforms is amazing.
Yes, thank you, Elon, if he is listening. I appreciate everything you've done for free speech. Our American politicians have done
free
crap.
Speech. It's close to it.
It's close enough for me. After what they tried to do to us, to give us experimental medicines that kill us, I am very happy with 99% free speech. I will take it.
Yes. And you'll just keep exploding, because people need to know what you're sharing with the world. So thank you for
Absolutely.
that.
Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Efra. Please keep doing what you're doing. We need our voice from Tel Aviv there. So, absolutely
Yeah,
looking forward to your content.
I will. Thank you so much. And on that note, thank you very much for listening, everyone.